Opening, the man behind the glass. There is an image that has circulated through intelligence circles, diplomatic back channels, and the studied analysis of Kremlin watchers for the better part of 4 years now. It is not a photograph, it is a description, a consistent, recurring description provided by multiple sources across multiple governments, all of whom have sat across a table or spoken on a line with officials who have been inside the room. The image is this: Vladimir Putin sitting at the far end of his famously absurd 20-foot-long white table, the table that has become, in its grotesque way, one of the most photographed pieces of furniture in the world, surrounded by generals, ministers, and advisors who have learned, through the careers of those who came before them and made the mistake of honesty, that their primary professional obligation is not to tell the truth. Their obligation is to reflect back to the man at the other end of the table what he already believes. And what Vladimir Putin believed going into February 24th of 2022 was something so catastrophically, so historically, so breathtakingly wrong that 4 years and 1,464 days later, the full weight of that wrongness is still being measured in blood. He believed he would win in 10 days, not a week, 10 days. That is the finding of the Royal United Services Institute, the United Kingdom's premier military think tank, which reported that Russian military planning was built around a timeline of 10 days for taking control of Ukraine. 10 days. What the Russian military actually got was not 10 days of a glorious special military operation, but 1,464 days of the most costly, the most catastrophic, the most strategically futile military campaign conducted by any major power anywhere on Earth since the Second World War. And the extraordinary, haunting, morally urgent question that hangs over everything we're going to talk about tonight is this: why hasn't it stopped? If it is this ruinous, if the numbers are this damning, if the strategic logic collapsed this completely, why is Vladimir Putin still doing this? The answer to that question is the story we are going to tell tonight, and I promise you, it is not the story you think it is. Section 1, the anatomy of a fatal miscalculation. To understand how this war became the trap it has become, you need to go back to the beginning, not to February 24th, 2022, the day the tanks rolled. You need to go further back than that, to the intellectual and psychological architecture that made the decision possible, to the long, slow process by which Vladimir Putin, operating inside a political system he had spent 2.5 decades personally constructing, became incapable of receiving accurate information about the country he was about to invade. Putin had written in a 5,000-word essay published in July 2021 that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that Ukrainian nationhood is an artificial Western construct, that the Ukrainian state has no authentic historical roots, that the government in Kiev was not a sovereign expression of Ukrainian will, but a puppet of Western powers who had manufactured Ukrainian identity as a geopolitical weapon against Russia. This was not diplomatic rhetoric. This was not strategic positioning for a negotiating table. This was what he actually believed. This was the operating assumption on which he built his invasion plan, and because it was what he believed, and because the system around him had been pruned over decades of anyone willing to tell him otherwise, no serious voice in the Kremlin raised its hand and said, "Vladimir Vladimirovich, we think you might be wrong about this." CNN's correspondent, reporting from Kiev on the 4th anniversary just days ago, described standing on the roof of a hotel on the morning of February 24th, watching missiles rain down on the capital, still struggling to process that it was actually happening. The invasion seemed almost impossible to imagine, she wrote, and yet there it was. What Putin got profoundly wrong was not military logistics, not weapons procurement, not even the specific tactical planning of the initial assault, though he got all of those wrong too. What he got catastrophically wrong was the human dimension. He could not imagine that Ukrainians would fight. He could not imagine that a comedian-turned-president would stand in the street in Kiev at midnight with a phone camera and a borrowed flak jacket and say to the entire watching world, "I am here. We are not putting down our weapons. We are defending our country." He could not imagine 44 million people deciding collectively in real time that they were a nation worth dying for. He could not imagine it because the system he built does not allow that kind of imagination, and so he ordered the invasion, and the invasion failed. And 4 years later, Russia is still there, not because the plan worked, but because the plan failed so completely that stopping has become more dangerous than continuing. Section 2, the blood arithmetic, numbers that should end careers and wars. Let us do something that I think we owe it to everyone involved in this conflict to do. Let us look at the numbers directly, without flinching, without the sanitizing buffer of diplomatic language, because the numbers in this war in February of 2026 are not just statistics, they are an indictment. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published its most comprehensive assessment of Russian military performance last month, and I want to walk you through what it found because the granularity of it is important. Since February 2022, Russian forces have suffered approximately 1.2 million casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. In 2025 alone, Russia suffered roughly 415,000 casualties, an average of nearly 35,000 per month. As many as 325,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since the invasion began. CSIS states this with analytical precision. No major power has suffered anywhere near these numbers of casualties or fatalities in any war since World War II. Let us put that into the sharpest possible relief. The United States suffered 54,287 battle deaths during the Korean War, 47,434 deaths in Vietnam, 2,465 in Afghanistan over 2 decades, 4,432 in Iraq. Combined across all of America's post-World War II conflicts, the United States has lost approximately 109,000 soldiers in battle. Russia has lost roughly 3 times that number in Ukraine in 4 years, and that is the conservative estimate. Some projections now put Russian battlefield fatalities between 288,000 and 409,000. Russian battlefield fatalities in Ukraine are more than 17 times greater than Soviet losses in Afghanistan, more than 11 times greater than both Chechen wars combined, more than 5 times greater than every Russian and Soviet military engagement since World War II put together. That is the sentence that should be read aloud in every Kremlin meeting room, in every conversation about whether this war is going well for Russia. And what has Russia gained for this? CSIS measured it. In 2024, Russian forces seized approximately 3,604 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, an area smaller than the state of Delaware. In 2025, they seized approximately 4,131 square kilometers, slightly larger, but still less than 1% of Ukraine's total landmass. In the Pokrovsk offensive, the campaign that Russia's military has been prosecuting for over a year, the assault that Moscow's propaganda presented as a major strategic advance, Russian forces advanced at an average rate of just 70 meters per day. 70 meters. To put that in context, that rate of advance is slower than the Allied advance during the Battle of the Somme in World War I, which is widely considered one of the most grinding, most futile, most bloodily inefficient military campaigns in the history of modern warfare. Russia is advancing more slowly in 2026 with all the technology and firepower of a 21st century military than soldiers advancing through the mud of the Western Front in 1916. And NATO's own commanders said it this week: Russia is losing thousands of troops for every single mile of ground it takes. The mathematics of this are not just strategically unsustainable. They describe a military that has been, in the precise and sober language of CSIS, reduced to the status of a second or third-rate power. A country that had 0, not 1, not 2, but 0. Companies in the global top 100 technology firms by market capitalization in 2025. A country whose space program, once the pride of Soviet achievement, launched 17 orbital missions in 2025 compared to 193 by the United States. A country whose most advanced AI model trails older versions of ChatGPT. This is what 4 years of this war has done to the Russian state, and Vladimir Putin is still at the end of that long white table telling his advisors they are winning. Section 3, the economy that is eating itself. Now let us talk about what is happening inside Russia's economy, because this is the part of the story that is going to determine how this war ends, not the frontline positions, not the territorial maps, but the slow-motion structural collapse happening inside the Russian economic system that even Putin's own advisors are now warning him about in terms that were unthinkable just 2 years ago. Russia's economy, to give it its honest diagnosis, has entered what Alexandra Prokopenko, a former advisor to Russia's central bank, someone who knows the internal architecture of this economy from the inside, has described in the pages of The Economist this month as the death zone. She is borrowing the language of mountaineering deliberately, and the metaphor is exact. In the death zone, above 8,000 meters, the body cannot sustain itself. It begins to consume its own muscle tissue. It metabolizes its own future capacity in order to keep the heart beating for a few more hours at altitude. The Russian economy, Prokopenko writes, is in negative equilibrium, holding itself together while steadily destroying its own future capacity. Consider what the numbers actually show. Russia is spending approximately half of its entire federal budget on the war, on the military-industrial complex, domestic security, and debt service. Half. Interest payments on the government debt accumulated by this war are now set to exceed Russia's combined spending on education and healthcare. The economy grew by just 0.6% in 2025, and the IMF projects growth of only 0.8% in 2026. Russian manufacturing contracted for 7 consecutive months in 2025. Consumer demand is weakening, inflation is stubbornly high. Russia's labor minister has warned Putin that the country faces a shortage of 2.4 million workers by 2030. The labor crisis is so acute that factories assembling civilian goods, automobiles, appliances, consumer electronics are cutting shifts because their workers have been pulled into the military or the military-industrial supply chain. Tank factories are running overtime. Car manufacturers are idling. That is not an economy building strength. That is an economy consuming its civilian foundations to feed a war machine that produces, by its very design, things that are meant to be destroyed. Oil revenues, the structural foundation of Putinomics, the financial pillar on which his entire political project has rested for a quarter century, crashed by approximately 50% in January of this year compared to the previous January. Western sanctions on Russia's energy exports, the shadow fleet of tankers that Russia uses to circumvent those sanctions, the coordinated European and American pressure on countries buying Russian oil, it is all finally biting in ways that are showing up in the budget numbers in ways that cannot be papered over. Russian officials, speaking anonymously to the Washington Post and other outlets, have warned internally that a financial crisis could hit Russia by the summer of 2026. A banking crisis is possible, one Russian official told reporters. A non-payments crisis is possible. I don't want to think about a continuation of the war or an escalation. This is someone inside the Russian system. Someone who, by every requirement of their professional survival, is supposed to be projecting confidence and loyalty, and they are quietly behind closed doors telling journalists, I am afraid of what comes next. And here is the precise and devastating irony at the center of this entire situation. Putin cannot stop, not because he doesn't know the economy is deteriorating, not because he is unaware of the casualty counts, not because he lacks the formal authority to order a ceasefire tomorrow morning. He cannot stop because his economy has been so completely militarized, so thoroughly reorganized around wartime production and wartime spending, that stopping the war would trigger the very economic crisis that the war is slowly building toward anyway. A military demobilization and bringing home hundreds of thousands of soldiers, shutting down the weapons factories, redirecting the defense budget toward civilian investment would not be a relief. It would be a shock. Hundreds of thousands of unemployed veterans, many with combat trauma and no civilian economic prospects, flooding a labor market already under severe strain against a backdrop of banking sector fragility and collapsing oil revenues. That is not a soft landing. That is precisely the kind of domestic instability that Putin has dedicated 26 years of authoritarian governance to preventing. He is, in the most structurally complete sense of the phrase, trapped by his own war. Section 4. The slow collapse of Russian society. There is another dimension to Russia's deterioration that receives far less coverage than the battlefield maps and the economic indicators, and it is in some ways the most consequential of all, because it operates on a timeline that extends decades beyond this war, regardless of how it ends. It is the social and demographic unraveling of the Russian state itself. The RAND Corporation published analysis just this week describing how Putin's carefully maintained project of keeping the war invisible to ordinary Russians, particularly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where political volatility would matter most, is increasingly failing. And the evidence for that failure is mounting in ways that the Kremlin's propaganda apparatus cannot fully contain. There are currently approximately 250,000 unemployed veterans of the war who have returned to Russia from Ukraine. The story surfaced briefly in Russian state media and was then apparently scrubbed, almost certainly on Kremlin orders, because the implications of 250,000 combat traumatized men without jobs or psychological support re-entering Russian society are, for a government obsessed with stability, genuinely alarming. Research published by Novaya Gazeta, the independent Russian outlet that has paid an enormous price for its journalism, documented that more than 8,000 veterans have been convicted of civilian crimes since returning from Ukraine. Veterans are twice as likely as comparable civilians to commit murder or cause serious injury. Domestic violence cases involving returned soldiers are documented. Crime, RAND analysts note, is rising across Russia in ways that track directly with the return of soldiers from the front, a pattern that mirrors in disturbing historical echo the destabilizing effect of Soviet veterans returning from Afghanistan in the 1980s, a process that contributed to the social and political unraveling that preceded the Soviet collapse. And then there is the demographic catastrophe that is building in slow motion beneath all of this. RAND cites research projecting that UN population scenarios anticipate Russia's population falling by between 25 and 50% by the year 2100, a decline driven by low birth rates, high mortality among working-age men, and the mass emigration of educated Russians who have been leaving the country in waves since 2022. Russia's fertility rate, already below replacement level before the invasion, is being further suppressed by the deaths and deployments of men in their reproductive years. A country that loses hundreds of thousands of young men to a war and then loses hundreds of thousands more of its most educated, most economically productive citizens to emigration is not building the foundations of future national power. It is liquidating them. And Putin, who has presented himself throughout his reign as the guarantor of Russian civilization and Russian national strength, is the author of this liquidation. Section 5. Britain, steadfast when it mattered most. I want to spend some time now on the story of Britain's role in this war because it is a story that deserves much more attention than it typically receives, and because in the current environment where American commitment to Ukraine has wavered, where the geopolitical ground beneath the Western alliance has been shifting, the United Kingdom's record of sustained, serious, and deeply consequential support for Ukraine stands as one of the most important strategic commitments made by any country in the democratic world over the past 4 years. Start at the beginning because the beginning tells you everything about intent. British NLAW, next-generation light anti-tank weapon, missiles arrived in Ukraine in January of 2022, weeks before the Russian invasion began. This was not a reaction. This was not a response to a crisis. This was a deliberate, forward-leaning decision by the British government to put lethal weapons capable of destroying Russian armor into Ukrainian hands before the tanks crossed the border, based on intelligence assessments that war was coming and a strategic judgment that Ukraine needed to be able to defend itself when it arrived. Those NLAWs, manufactured in Belfast, fielded by Ukrainian territorial defense forces with minimal training, are credited by military analysts with being among the decisive instruments of the Battle of Kyiv. They helped destroy the armored columns. They helped turn the Russian advance on the capital from a 10-day procession into a catastrophic defeat that forced Russian forces to withdraw from the north of Ukraine entirely. The first weapons that helped save Ukraine were British, and they were there before the war started. 4 years later, Britain has not stepped back from that commitment by a single inch. This week, on the 4th anniversary of the full-scale invasion, Prime Minister Keir Starmer convened a coalition of the willing call. The UK government announced $500 million in additional air defense support, along with 1,000 lightweight multi-role missiles produced in Belfast to counter Russia's drone campaign, and the Defense Secretary pledged what he called the full weight of British military, humanitarian, and diplomatic support for Ukraine. The UK committed $4.5 billion in direct military financing in 2025 alone, making it one of Ukraine's single largest bilateral donors. Just this month, Britain pledged an additional $205 million to purchase American weapons for Ukraine through a NATO procurement framework, stepping directly into the gap left by the curtailment of U.S. direct military assistance. Britain brought its total energy infrastructure support to Ukraine, money specifically directed at repairing the power grid that Russia is systematically bombing, to over $490 million so. And then there are the details that speak louder than any headline figure. British military surgeons and nurses are physically embedded in Ukrainian field hospitals right now, not training Ukrainian doctors from a base in Poland, not advising via satellite link from London, but standing inside operating theaters in Ukraine side by side with Ukrainian medical teams helping treat the catastrophic blast injuries of soldiers who were hit last night on a front line 30 miles away. British RAF bases are training Ukrainian pilots to become helicopter flying instructors, building not just a capability but a pipeline so that Ukraine can train its own aviators for the long term. And in January of this year, the United Kingdom and France jointly signed a declaration of intent with President Zelensky confirming that British and French troops will physically deploy to Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire, not as occupying forces, not as combatants, but as the visible, uniformed guarantee that any future Russian attempt to restart the war will not go unanswered. A 70-person multinational headquarters is already operational. The UK has accelerated $200 million to fund that deployment. Britain is not just supporting Ukraine from a distance. Britain is telling Moscow, in language that requires no translation, that it plans to be there when the shooting stops. Prime Minister Starmer said it plainly this week. For all the noise in world affairs today, this war remains the most critical issue of our age. He said Ukraine's defense is Britain's security. He said Russia is not winning and will not win. And then he said 3 words that have become the only appropriate benediction for any serious statement about this conflict: Slava Ukraini. He said it as a prime minister. He said it as a commitment. He said it as a man who understands that the line between what happens on the plains of the Donbass and what happens on the streets of London is shorter than the geography suggests. Section 6, the strategic landscape, what the war is really deciding. Let us zoom out now. Let us look at this war not as a bilateral conflict between two neighboring countries, but as what it actually is, the most consequential test of the post-1945 international order in the history of that order, because that is what is genuinely at stake here, not just territory, not just Zelensky versus Putin, not just the question of which flag flies over Donetsk. What is being decided in Ukraine in real time with real blood is whether the foundational rules of the international system, the rules that say borders cannot be redrawn by force, that sovereignty is not conditional on the approval of larger neighbors, that ethnic cleansing and cultural erasure are crimes and not policies, whether those rules still have any operative meaning in the 21st century, or whether they have become, in the age of resurgent authoritarianism, merely decorative. And on that question, the broadest, most consequential version of the question, Vladimir Putin has already lost. He set out to push NATO back from Russia's borders. Instead, he triggered the fastest and most consequential expansion of the NATO alliance in its history. Finland's accession alone more than doubled the land border between Russia and NATO states overnight, a strategic outcome so catastrophically counter to Putin's stated objectives that it would be almost comic if it weren't purchased in the currency of so much human suffering. Sweden joined the alliance, two nations that were militarily non-aligned for decades, that built their entire post-war identities around neutrality, looked at what Russia did in Ukraine, and decided clearly and decisively that neutrality was no longer a viable survival strategy. Poland is building the largest conventional army in Europe. Germany has undergone the most significant reorientation of its defense posture in its post-war history. The Baltic states are investing in defense at rates they have not seen since the Cold War. Europe as a whole is rearming, slowly, unevenly, not yet at the pace that the threat demands, but in a direction that is unmistakable and irreversible. Russia's international isolation is also deeper and more structurally damaging than its propaganda apparatus acknowledges. Western sanctions have forced Russia into an increasingly dependent relationship with China, a relationship that multiple analyses confirm is fundamentally unequal. Russia has become the junior partner, the dependent client, the supplier of raw materials to a Chinese economy that determines the terms of every transaction. As the Center for European Policy Analysis put it this month, the relationship is unbalanced because Moscow is more dependent on Beijing than Beijing is on Moscow. China has significantly increased exports to Russia of dual-use goods, computer chips, machine tools, radars, sensors, that Russia needs to keep its weapons factories running. But China is not doing this out of solidarity. China is doing this because it serves Chinese interests. Russia has, in its desperation for economic lifelines, traded its strategic autonomy for a supply chain. It has gone from presenting itself as a co-equal of the great powers to functioning as a raw materials exporter and technology importer for its neighbor to the east. This is not the trajectory of a rising power. This is the trajectory of a declining one. Section 7, Ukraine, the nation that refused to not exist. And now at last we come to the part of this story that is the most important part. Not the economics, not the geopolitics, not the military indicators and the territorial maps. The part that is the most important is the part that cannot be fully quantified, cannot be fully modeled, cannot be fully captured in any analytical framework, because it lives in a dimension that is fundamentally human, fundamentally moral, and fundamentally about the choices that people make when everything is at stake. Ukraine, as of today, is not losing this war. I want to say that carefully and precisely because it is a more complicated statement than it sounds, and I want to be honest about the full complexity of it. Ukraine is under extraordinary pressure. Its energy grid has been subjected to the most sustained infrastructure bombing campaign since World War II. Russia launched approximately 55,000 kamikaze drones at Ukrainian targets in 2025 alone, a five-fold increase over the year before, targeting heating plants, power stations, water systems, and the railway network that keeps the country logistically alive. Ukraine's energy system can currently meet only 60% of national electricity demand. Civilians are living through the toughest winter in memory with 4 to 8 hours of power a day, sometimes less, in temperatures that drop to Arctic lows. The UN documented at least 161 civilian deaths and 757 injuries in Ukraine in January 2026 alone. Civilian casualties in 2025 were 31% higher than in 2024. The trajectory is getting worse, not better. And yet, Volodymyr Zelensky is still in Kiev. He has not fled. He has not hidden. He showed up at the Munich Security Conference this month and stood in front of the assembled leaders of the democratic world and told them that Putin has already started World War III, not as a metaphor, not as rhetorical escalation, but as his genuine assessment of what is happening. He called for faster weapons deliveries, for sustained commitment, for the kind of political courage from Western leaders that matches the physical courage of his soldiers on the front. And then he went back to Kyiv, back to the capital of a country that is still being bombed. Ukraine has liberated at least 168.9 square kilometers of territory in its southern theater since January 1st of this year, according to the Institute for the Study of War. Ukrainian forces have successfully counterattacked in Kupiansk and in other sectors. Rusai analysts noted this week that Ukraine's best military units have developed new offensive tactics suited to the specific conditions of this war, the drone-saturated, fortified, attritional battlefield of the Eastern Front, and are beginning to spread those innovations more widely through the force. Ukraine's armed forces now number 900,000 active personnel, the fifth largest military in the world. Its defense budget with foreign military aid stands at $71 billion. It operates one of the most sophisticated drone fleets on the planet. Its domestic defense industry now covers approximately 50% of its military needs, production achieved largely under the conditions of deliberate enemy bombardment of its industrial power supply. This is not the profile of a country that is breaking. This is the profile of a country that has been forced by the most extreme pressure imaginable to become something it was not before the war began, a serious, hardened, innovative military and industrial power that is adapting to this war faster than Russia is. What fuels all of it, underneath the weapons and the budgets and the tactical innovations, is something that no amount of Russian drone strikes can destroy, because it does not live in any building that can be targeted. It lives in people. It lives in the grandmother in Kharkiv who stayed when her entire neighborhood evacuated, who told a journalist she was staying because someone had to water the plants. It lives in the young engineer who repairs a bombed substation at 3 in the morning in February, knowing that the hospital 6 kilometers away needs power before morning. It lives in the soldier who has been rotating in and out of frontline positions for 3 years, who is tired in every cell of his body, who has lost friends and seen things that will never leave him, and who still reports for duty tomorrow morning because he decided, or a long time ago now, in the first week of this war, that Ukraine was worth saving. These people are not abstractions. They are not policy variables. They are the reason this analysis matters and the reason this war continues to be decided by human will as much as by military hardware. Section 8. The Crossroads. What the world must choose. We are at a moment, and I want to be honest about this because pretending otherwise would be a disservice to everything we have covered tonight, where the outcome is genuinely uncertain, not because Ukraine is weak, not because Ukraine lacks the will or the capability, but because the single most important variable in determining how this war ends is not on the front line in Donbass. It is in the capitals of the democratic world. It is in the willingness of governments in London and Paris and Berlin and Warsaw and Brussels and yes, in Washington, to maintain and intensify the pressure on Russia at the precise moment when Russia's economic vulnerabilities are greatest and when Putin's domestic political risks are beginning to expand. Arusi is explicit about this in its most recent analysis. Russia will continue its aggression if the cost of doing so remains manageable, but if the battlefield slows significantly, if the economic pain deepens materially, if the pressure on oil revenues through sanctions intensifies, if the shadow fleet is disrupted, if the supply chains that China is providing are constrained, the Kremlin's calculus shifts. The leverage point exists. The question is whether the world has the will to pull the lever. The UK and Sweden's finance ministers published a joint statement just hours ago with a title that cuts directly to the core of the matter. Don't believe Putin's lies. Economic pressure is working. They wrote that Russia is at its weakest economically since the invasion began. They called for sustaining and intensifying that pressure. They are right. And the democracies of the world need to hear that and act accordingly. Because here's the alternative. Here's what happens if the pressure fades, if the Western coalition loses its nerve, if the ceasefire frameworks being discussed in various capitals produce an agreement that leaves Ukraine militarily weakened, stripped of its defensive positions, and exposed to a reconstituted Russian military that will use any pause to reload and return. Russia's stated maximalist demands include the complete cessation of Western military support for Ukraine as a precondition for peace. If Russia gets that, the ceasefire is not peace, it is intermission. And Ukraine, which has bled for 4 years to remain an independent country, will be left standing on indefensible ground with the promise of security guarantees that history provides little reason to trust. Closing, what 4 years has taught us about courage. Camera holds close. The anchor pauses, a beat of absolute silence, then speaks slowly, quietly, with complete deliberateness. I want to end tonight not with a forecast or a policy recommendation or a geopolitical projection. I want to end with something simpler and in some ways harder to hold because it asks something of us that is more demanding than simply understanding the situation. 1,464 days ago, day one, a woman named Irina was standing in her apartment in Kyiv when the first missiles hit. She described the sound later to a journalist as not what she expected, not a movie explosion, but something more like the sky itself cracking, like the atmosphere splitting open along a seam that was never supposed to be there. She grabbed her daughter, she grabbed her documents, she went downstairs to the metro station and sat on the floor of a tunnel 30 meters underground while the city above her was attacked. And in that tunnel, in the darkness, surrounded by hundreds of other people who had also grabbed their children and their documents and come underground, she made a decision. She decided she was not leaving. She decided that if her country was going to fight, she was going to be part of it, not with a gun, with everything else. With her work, her presence, her taxes, her refusal to let the darkness be the last word. Multiply Irina by 44 million people, and you begin to understand what Vladimir Putin encountered when he sent his tanks across the border expecting a procession. He encountered a nation, not a geographic expression, not an administrative unit of a historical empire. A nation, a people who had decided in the aggregate and in the individual that their existence was non-negotiable and their sovereignty was not subject to anyone else's revision. Putin has tried to freeze them out. He has sent 55,000 drones in a single year to destroy their heating systems and their power stations and their water treatment plants. He has shelled their cities, bombed their hospitals, deported their children, outlawed their language in the territories he occupies, and instructed his generals to make their country uninhabitable. And they have stayed, they have repaired, they have adapted, they have fought back with innovations in drone warfare that are now being studied in military academies around the world. They have built a defense industry capable of meeting half their military needs under conditions of deliberate bombardment. They have remained in the most precise and defiant meaning of the Ukrainian word nezlamny, the unbroken. Vladimir Putin is in a trap of his own making. His economy is consuming itself. His military is losing thousands of soldiers for every mile of ground it takes. His society is being quietly hollowed out by the return of traumatized veterans, by demographic decline, by the mass emigration of the educated and the talented who looked at what their country was becoming and chose a different future. The man who started this war thinking it would take 10 days has watched it become the longest, most costly, most strategically ruinous military adventure in Russian history since the Second World War. He cannot win it, and because he cannot win it, because he built an economy and a political system that has now fused itself to this war, he cannot stop it either. Not without risking the implosion of everything he built. He is trapped. He is at altitude in the death zone, consuming his nation's future just to keep breathing at elevation. But Ukraine is still standing 4 years on, exhausted and cold and grieving, having paid a price in human life that no nation should ever be asked to pay. Ukraine is still standing. Zelensky is still in Kyiv. The lights are coming back on every time Russia turns them off. The guns are still firing. The drone factories are still running. And somewhere in the country tonight, in a basement in Kharkiv, in a trench in the Donbass, in a hospital in Zaporizhzhia, in a repaired substation somewhere in the dark, and there's a Ukrainian person who is tired and cold and grieving and absolutely unequivocally refusing to give up. We owe them our attention. We owe them our understanding. We owe them the truth about what is happening and what it means. And the democracies of this world owe them the sustained, serious, unflinching support that their courage has earned 4 times over. The question is whether we are equal to what they have asked of us. They have not asked us to fight for them. They have only asked us not to look away, not to lose our nerve, not to allow the noise of other politics and other crises to drown out the sound of what is happening on day 1,464 of a war that the whole democratic world has a stake in. I believe we can be equal to that. I have to believe it. Because the alternative, a world in which Vladimir Putin's bet on Western cowardice turns out to be correct and is not a world that any of us will be comfortable living in. Slava Ukraini.